Today, we're talking about the history of queer representation in cinema, and I'm joined by the fabulous Claudia Hampton. Claudia, could you please introduce yourself?
Hello, I'm Claudia Hampton. I am currently studying documentary in Berlin. This is Berlin, looks great. I did English literature at university for my bachelor's, and I actually focused a lot of my dissertation on the representation of trans people and people of color in films like Paris is Burning, Rocky Horror, and yeah, just generally like drag culture as well.
I have to ask, do you have a favorite out of those films, or is it like asking you to choose
Yeah.
between your children?
Oh, so I did the three, Rocky Horror, Paris is Burning, and then I did The Queen. It's a documentary from I think like 1961, which would be amazing if I get that right. I think my favorite has to be Paris is Burning. I mean, I watched that film so much. That's 100% one of my favorite films of all time. I love it.
It's on my watch list for our another season in our podcast where we'll be talking about trans and queer representation in film. But so I'm very excited to watch it, but I'm sort of saving myself. But yeah, I was just hoping you could start off with telling us about why you think queer representation in film is important.
I think it's very important that people want to see themselves portrayed on screen. Film is like a way to really sort of show life as it is. I know that probably sounds really corny, but I think it would just be like a massive disservice to like the any kind of community that you live in if you didn't have any kind of queer representations. Queer people are everywhere. We've come into like, especially in like sort of the last 20 years, we've really been talking about like sexuality as a spectrum, the gender binary, and all of those discussions and sort of this like way of thinking really needs to be represented on screen as well. It's just, yeah, you'd be cutting out like a massive part of society, life, people. And it's important for people, especially like young people who are maybe going through figuring out what their sexuality is or what their gender identity is. It's really important to have positive representations on screen that they can identify with. It was very helpful for me, and actually there are a couple of instances when I was growing up where I really like that really cemented like how I felt about myself, because I saw people I could identify with on screen. And there were instances where it's sort of there were maybe representations that weren't so positive that kind of maybe made me a bit more fearful. So even though we need queer representation, I think it does have to be done in the right way. But it's all about, I guess, yeah, just being truthful about what's around us.
And I think it's really interesting that you mentioned that, because I saw a statistic recently that it was less than 5% of people in America personally know a trans person. So, and I think that speaks volumes across why representation is so important, because with little echo chambers and bubbles that everybody lives in, they don't really get to meet people from other walks of life as much as we might hope. So it's so important that these representations are done accurately, because otherwise the 95% of people who've never met a trans person will think that one film they saw with a trans person, that is their life and that is their experience, and that is how they are. So I also wanted to ask, how do you think the representation of queer people in cinema has changed over time, and sort of the maybe a specific time frame? I'm not sure if you can recall this, the first time it happened, but in your study of the subject, what differences have you noticed over the years?
I mean, a lot of people who were portrayed as gay or gay characters on screen were essentially killed at the end of the films, or they would be heartbroken. It would just be kind of like a negative like narrative that they would be involved in. And sometimes these films are really important to have. Like Boys Don't Cry was a film that I can't remember what year it came out, but in the 90s, I think. And that was Hilary Swank played a trans man on screen, and won, I think, an Oscar for it. And it was really great to have a film talking about trans issues in this. And it's also based on a true story, but it was so like quite a scary film, I think. Well, I'm not a trans person, so I can't really say to any trans experience, but I would say that like that would be quite a scary film to watch, seeing somebody so much violence.
Yeah.
It's a really important story to tell. But for me, I really wanted to see like positive stories where like love, relationships, like happiness are all possible for queer people. So I think that's one of the things that really is coming now that I've seen a lot, is that there's a lot more positive narratives surrounding queer people, like especially with like family relationships and yeah, like sexual and like romantic relationships as well. I also think that yeah, like the difference as well, just like within the filmmaking, a lot of people who would potentially play gay characters or trans characters would be actually straight cis people themselves. And now people who are actually trans or actually gay or lesbian are playing these roles, which is great to see because you can bring so much more authenticity to the role. So that's, I mean, definitely what's happened in Pose, which is great. It's like the most trans actors ever in a show, I think, and it's written by a trans woman. Yeah, and also I actually started watching this show Anne Plus. It's a Dutch TV show and they've just made a film. And it's basically about a lesbian who lives in Amsterdam and has sort of friendships and relationships. And it's written by the woman who's the main character and two other women who are all part of the queer community. And I think you can really, really tell that. Just seeing people who are queer playing queer roles is really a nice like transition as well.
And why do you think it's important that queer writers and queer actors are, you know, represented in these roles? Why wouldn't it be okay for a cis man to play a trans queer woman?
If somebody was playing a lesbian, I'm going to identify so much more with that person if the actor is also queer or gay, just because they can bring that level of authenticity. It's also important that the people who have gone through the stories that we're telling, like actually in their own lives, are able to express that. It's probably less sensationalized, just more honest accounts. And I also think that like a lot of queer actors and writers have been marginalized a lot, and a lot of prejudice against, like especially in the film industry. So it's really important that when these roles and jobs are being offered out, that the people who they actually like correspond to are getting them and not being just like exiled or like put away from a community and a story that they can actually tell really well because they have experience in that. It's important to very much be a part of like how your own community is being portrayed.
I think that's something that's coming up a lot more in, I guess, you know, popular culture commentary, that for a while we were happy enough with actors just being from that community, but then we realized actually when you turn around the camera, that you need that the people who are writing the stories and directing the stories also need to be representative of the community as well, that you don't just, it's not enough to just have the actors be really diverse and for all of the crew and all of the cast to not be diverse. I think you see that in a film like Green Book, which when everybody thought it was this like amazing cultural film about the Black experience, and when they went to get their Oscar, out of the, I think it was 40 people on stage, 2 people were Black, which was just so gobsmacking that I think we're realizing now. And I think just to, yeah, not to take it away from this, but I think you'd be surprised if you looked back at how many stories of the initial stories about people from the queer community were not written by queer people. Because if you look at, I did a deep dive on the Black community on this recently, and I was absolutely shocked by how many of them had white actors, they're Black actors, but white writers, white directors. So things like Fresh Prince of Bel-Air, there wasn't a Black person in sight behind the camera, which I found, which is such a cult like Black family TV show. But I think, yeah, that representation throughout all levels is so important, because as you mentioned before, otherwise you're relying on stereotypes. If you're not from that community, and unless you have, you know, a real in with that community, and by which I mean maybe a family member is in that, or your partner is in that, something like that, where you've got real lived experience that you can draw upon, if you don't have that, you just have to rely on stereotypes because you've got nothing else to work with.
I think also like even with actors that are playing queer roles, I mean, if we look back at like something like Brokeback Mountain, you've got two straight men, Jake Gyllenhaal and Heath Ledger, playing gay men. And at the time, like for big Hollywood actors that they were, that was super groundbreaking because suddenly these straight men are saying, I'm happy to play a gay character, which was great like at the time. But now I just feel like we're a little bit past it where like now it's really time to hand those roles over to like the queer community and make it something like that's a bit more authentic and honest, and yeah, not relying on stereotypes. And there's a TV show that I watched. It was originally written as like a mini 9 novels, and so he wrote it about this very green girl from the South coming to San Francisco and then sort of falling in with a bunch of like misfits in this beautiful house at Barbary Lane, that was run by a trans woman, and there's a couple of gay people who live there, and she sort of opened up this new sort of queer community. And they did the TV show in the 90s. And at the time, it was like, again, very groundbreaking, something that a lot of people were they had a lot of hate towards because it was suddenly showing gay people, you know, being quite like at the forefront of their screens. But then they redid the series really recently, I think like 2 years ago. And it's so great. But the difference is that they got now a lot of queer writers on the show. And also Olympia Dukakis plays the trans woman, Anna Madrigal, who owns the house, Barbary Lane. And she's not a trans woman. And so now what they did in this vamp version of it, they basically still got Olympia Dukakis to play Anna Madrigal, but they did a whole backstory to her in flashbacks. So they're trying to kind of, while maintaining like this some continuity from the last series in the 90s, also trying to make sure that those roles are available for the queer community. And it's just like a really great show. It's super colorful and like definitely really positive, but very complex. And the representation also has widened a lot. In the original show, it was very much like the main woman lives with who's played by Laura Linney. She lives with a gay man, a sort of bisexual woman, and then this trans woman who runs Barbary Lane, the house. And in this new season, you've got a whole new cast of characters with lots of different gender identities, sexual expression, sexual identities, everything. So it's really like, and it has this very much like family dynamic with all of them. So it's really nice to see the queer community represented in so many different ways. So I really like that. And I think that's a massive credit to the writers as well, because they're like, okay, the queer community isn't just this lesbian woman or this gay man. There's a whole lot of other people who are, you know, also existing.
You mentioned that it's powerful for shows to, iconic shows in particular, to remake themselves with a more inclusive angle to them. Is that what you see as the future of film and TV? Because for me, what I love about a TV show like Euphoria, for instance, is that their gender identity and their sexuality don't consume them as characters. It's not, this is a show about gay people, this is all that there is to know about them, and this is everything that they are. They don't have to come out, none of them come out to their families, it's just a normal thing. And second of all, what I loved about it is that because it's so popular, it completely combats that idea that they had in cinema for a long time, that if you use a marginalized group, your film or show becomes niche. If you use a Black queer woman, which is Zendaya in this film, in this TV show, if you use a Black queer woman, only Black queer people will watch it, so you're minimizing your earnings. And I think it's such a powerful show, and that's so mainstream, that it's so wonderful to see a marginalized experience represented and being popular. And I just personally love that.
I really agree with what you said about like not basically just distilling the characters down to like their sexuality or their gender identity. And that's something that I really think I've only seen in a couple of shows or films. And actually somebody who does it really well is Russell T Davies. He wrote or directed like the Doctor Who when David Tennant was Doctor Who.
That was the best era of Doctor Who.
It really was. It was the best for sure. I saw his show years and years. It centers around this family in Manchester, and they're all quite a diverse family. Like you've got people of color in there, people with disabilities, different sexual orientations, but not one of those characters was ever diminished to whatever that label was ever. And that was something that was really like very interesting to me and kind of sparked a massive thing of being like, that's where I really want to see queer representation go. Is not just to be making shows that are like, this is a show for lesbians, this is a show like and I really do enjoy like shows that are about the queer community, because I really like just love seeing the like passion and the relationships in them, especially when they're positive. But I would love to see more just queer characters just within TV shows and films that aren't defined by that. I think it is happening more. I mean, Sex Education was quite good at it, but I mean, they talk about those issues as well, but I don't think anybody's like, there was never any coming out scene for characters like Eric. He was just always gay, you know? And that I really like connect with, because I never really came out, I don't think, ever. So like when people are having these dramatic coming out scenes and it's like tears and crying, obviously that's some people's experience. It was never mine, and I'm very lucky to have that and privileged to have that. But like I just kind of came back to my friends one day and was like, I fancy a girl, I think. And they were like, okay. And that was it.
Do you think we're moving beyond that? Because that's what I would hope for, because I think it's important to not assume heteronormativity, which means people don't have to come out. And I think it's actually quite strange that people have to have this big ceremony and announcement to let everybody know. Why do they have, first of all, why do they have to let everybody know? And second of all, why did everybody assume they were straight until this very moment?
You don't come out as straight. I mean, like if I ever have children, I really hope that they come out as straight to me, because that would just make me laugh. But yeah, like I just don't even, it is a really bizarre kind of concept. I mean, I hope we're kind of moving away from it, and that it can just, but obviously it's definitely a privilege for me to say that in a way, because I'm surrounded by a lot of people who are very accepting, and some people aren't. So it's like, some people aren't accepting of it, so it is a massive deal for people. I mean, it would be great if it wasn't, but the reality is that it like, so, and that's the thing, is it's really important to have lots of different types of experiences portrayed on screen, because not everybody's is completely different. And I think for a long time the same kind of narrative was being put out there, of the like trauma and violence and death, and like it's totally an experience for sure, and like that happens a lot. But I think it's also really important to have nuance and complexity and lots of different experience, both positive and negative. Like not everybody is just having the best time being gay the whole time, but it's wave, you know?
That's the thing, isn't it? That I remember listening to a Desert Island Disc with Alan Carr on it, and he was talking about how he gets interviewed a lot and people ask him, how do you feel about being the representative for the gay community? Or, you know, what does the gay community think about this? And he's like, I'm not the entire gay community. He was saying that it's absolutely ridiculous that one single person should suddenly be the representative for, you know, a large group of people, and that he's just one gay man. And I think the same applies with television, that if you're having more representation, by default each representation becomes less significant in a good way, because that's why it's not a problem if a white cis straight man is represented as, I don't know, a murderer, because there's for that this one character there are a million good characters out there. And that's why I was watching Disclosure on Netflix, and basically, if anyone hasn't seen it, it's a TV show that goes through the representation of trans people in film.
I watched this, it was great. The film Psycho was like showing like this how like basically dressing up the mother, who is like actually Norman Bates, is a psychopath killer, and it was portraying like trans women and trans people as psychopathic killers the whole time. Like it's, and because
really, there's so few, And there are so few representations of trans people in popular cinema at that time, that came to represent them, when there should be hundreds of films that represent them, so that you get that wealth of representation.
Talking about Disclosure though quickly, because I know she's in it, Laverne Cox, love
Love
her, she's
them.
amazing. But Orange is the New Black was probably one of the first TV shows that I saw, and I saw it when I was probably like 15, maybe I think I was 14, 15. So that was like peak me kind of coming out in my brain, not to anyone, but like in my brain. And seeing that, where it was like an amazing cast of people who were portraying like lesbian relationships and queer relationships in loads of different ways. And also this thing is like, you kind of said, like when we were talking before about how like the Black community were like portrayed as like killers and then like godlike figures, and with like gay characters as well and queer community. So there's this really great drag queen, Trixie Mattel, I'm sure, yeah, and Katya, they have a show. I'm obviously obsessed. I watch it all the time. I love them. But they always talk about, they're like, I hate how people think that just gay people are just really fun and nice to be around. Like, we're not, like, there are really horrible gay people out there. And like, they always complain about it, how they're like, everyone thinks we're so nice all the time. And like, this is one of the things I think that like, there's that stereotype of like the GBF, like the gay best friend, and like always happy and up and stuff. And like queer people are also like good and bad in many different ways. And I think Orange is the New Black was like a really good show to show how people have like duality of those kind of things in them. Nobody's just purely good and fun and happy. And you're just like human people who have experiences and reactions and emotions. So yeah, also like that was a nice show to see that like not everybody is perfect, especially like in these kind of gay roles.
Absolutely. So we touched on this a little bit earlier about why it's important for minority characters to be represented on screen. And another thing that I think more criticism is emerging around is making sure you've got that representation behind the cameras in the writing rooms. And I was just wondering, why do you think it's important for queer people to tell queer stories?
So I think it's also like mainly about perspective as well. So we kind of talked a little bit about like the stereotypes that can be portrayed in certain narratives. But I also think that you have so much more freedom as a like person who's speaking on their own community to maybe do other things that aren't like so heavy, like comedy as well. You can be like self-critical. You can poke fun at these kind of misconceptions or stereotypes or even things within the community as well. I think like one of the films that does this really well is But I'm a Cheerleader. It's by Jamie Babbitt and it has Natasha Lyonne and Claire Duvall in. And this is like, again, a film that I saw when I was like just coming out or whatever. And it's a comedy, and it's basically about a girl Natasha Lyonne plays who's a cheerleader, and she's like really femme and prissy, but her parents think she's gay, which she is, spoiler. And they send her off to like a conversion therapy camp, and it's like the most ridiculous thing ever. Like the boys have to wear blue and the girls have to wear pink, and the girls have to like learn how to hoover and the boys have to like chop wood, and like it's really absurd, but it is a comedy. And it's kind of just poking fun at the absurdity of like conversion camps, like conversion therapies and stuff like this, but also I guess like within these like stereotypes, not only of like the gender norms and the gender binary, but also within like the actual stereotypes of gay people that were portrayed on screen. Like a lot of the time people would think that like a lesbian would be like a butch lesbian, and I think this was like one of the first times that I saw a film where the main character, the heroine, was actually like femme and would probably on the outside, whatever that means, like not look gay, but she's super gay. And also it has a happy ending, which is great. So yeah, I think that really wouldn't have, not only like the comedy of poking fun at like the misconceptions from everyone else about stereotypes, but also within like the kind of maybe like how people even within the community portray gay people or lesbians as like this butch character. I don't think that would have been able to have been achieved without somebody who was a queer lesbian writer and director at the helm. So I think that actually having people who are part of the community, it gives a level of like, I don't know, you can have more interesting discussions and narratives about it, and yeah, comedy as well.
Well, that begs the question, can straight people tell queer stories, do you think? And sorry, I mean, obviously they can, and anyone can do anything really, but do you think they should?
I kind of I do think yes, but I hope that it's more like a thing of like, it would be great if I would like, yes, of course they should, absolutely, but that would really be if like we've come to a point where everybody's like educated and knowledgeable about things about the queer community. Like I would never want to stop somebody telling a really powerful, great story. Like I actually think the writer of Euphoria is straight.
Yes, I'm Levinson. I'm pretty sure he is.
Yeah, and so I don't think that like people should be like, no, you're not gay, so you can't write about gay stories. But I think that if you are, like, you just need to make sure that you're also maybe consulting with people. You're having, and also you don't make something just by yourself. It's a massive team effort. So there's so much possibility to then bring on other writers or certain directors, or look to different sources for all of your information. And like, you know, I think that's kind of the better way to go about it. I think it would be a great opportunity for some straight people to educate themselves on different queer representations and narratives if they started to decide, okay, I'm going to write a queer story. And it's an opportunity to involve the queer community for sure in like telling that narrative.
Another thing I've noticed is that with the popularity of TV shows like Euphoria or It's a Sin or Drag Race, I noticed. Pardon?
That was Russell T Davis. It's a Sin.
Oh yes. Oh, well, it's fabulous. But I
we
think
love you, Russell, if you're out there.
Pardon?
I just said we love you, Russell, if you're out there.
I think what I've really noticed with the people who watch these TV shows and, you know, more queer films, that generally they're either from the community or straight women. I think I don't know if this is something you've noticed as well. Few of the straight men I know are going to sit down and watch Euphoria or It's a Sin, when actually they're probably the people who need to watch it the most. And how do you think we can move forwards from that? Or do you see it as a problem, and what do you think we can do about it? And Drag Race especially.
Yeah, I know. I mean, maybe one of the things actually, and this kind of relates to what you were saying before, is having like non-queer shows, things that are just like on TV that aren't specifically LGBTQI, are like having queer characters in them and not being identified as like, not being like their character isn't the fact that they're just queer, kind of what we talked on before. I think if you start doing that more, of putting people in just like, I don't know, blockbuster dramas that just happen to be a lesbian, people who are like, I mean, like if you put like a lesbian in Avengers, I 100% know all of my guy friends are going to watch Avengers. Okay. And so that's the thing, is like just kind of putting these characters in and not identifying them, or like not making them purely the gay character or the queer character or the trans character, is great to do that. And I mean, I think it's kind of, we definitely I don't want to say to do this, but it's almost like looking back on what was happening with Brokeback Mountain by getting like straight famous Hollywood actors to play gay characters, really probably made then a lot of the industry actually watch these films and take these stories seriously and take these people seriously. Now I think it's just about making sure that there is representation in like pretty much all, or like most like films and TV shows. And these people not being just like identified as their sexuality or gender identity, and normalize more, I guess.
I would add a clause to that having having queer groups in mainstream shows that aren't about them being gay, and letting them kiss on them. That is something that has really infuriated me in watching something like Modern Family, where it's meant to be this really, really progressive show, but the idea that, you know, the popular culture has this idea that for some reason queer love is like X-rated love, that straight couples can kiss or snog or do whatever on camera, but if a queer couple kiss, it's not suitable for children. And that is something I would want to see a lot more of on mainstream television, that not just these queer couples who hold hands, but these queer couples who are allowed to be romantic and intimate with each other. I think we saw that with Strictly, who had their first all male dance group, dance partners, and I watched the night they did the Romba, which is a very sexual dance, it's a very intimate dance, and they both cried at the end of it because they said, we're never able to show this side of ourselves, that we're, you know, deeply like emotional and sensual people, we always have to sort of hide that part of ourselves. So I think that's what I would add as a clause.
I mean, there's definitely the stereotype that, like, especially with gay men, that they're like super promiscuous. And there's also the stereotype that like lesbians like settle down after a month and like have 5 cats and a baby, you know, like, and so I think, yeah, again, like, to have nuance in characters, make sure that like there is, and oh, actually, this is interesting because I do think that like lesbian representations, especially, it's if it's written by like a straight person, you can so see that like it can be really heavily sexualized. Blue is the Warmest Color is like the one that's kind of popping into my mind. I actually think the acting in it is amazing, and I did cry in this film, but the sex scene is 5.5 minutes long, and I'm just like, I don't know, I could just tell like it was a man directing this. I could just tell. And I do think that like lesbian relationships are like heavily sexualized for male gratification. Also, like historically, lesbianism wasn't even really seen as a sexuality, whereas gay men had it like completely differently, where it was like heavily criminalized.
Yeah.
And then now are seen as like very promiscuous. And actually, like, it's important to show that like love and relationships and like really like you know, intimacy, yeah, that kind of thing exists. Yeah, so I agree.
Thank you so much for joining us today, Claudia, and for your lovely insights. And thank you to anybody watching. We hope you enjoyed it, and have a good rest of your day.
Thanks. Have a wonderful day. Goodbye, everyone.